We'll get started here on the talk. Thanks for coming by this afternoon. I'm Stefan Shakow, one of the folks who works on the Azure website service back at Microsoft. And today I'm going to be walking you through some information on what's involved with developing both against the Windows Azure website service, as well as how you can tie together those websites with SharePoint Online, so you get an idea of how you can use both aspects of Windows Azure and our cloud offerings together. So, first half of the talk, I'm going to be going through sort of at a high rate of speed, a lot of info about what is Windows Azure websites, and go through a number of scenarios on how we use it and how you can interact with it as developers. And then from there, we'll shift gears, and I will use an example of a website running up on the Azure website service and show you some steps for how you can integrate it and tie it together with a tenancy that I have set up running on SharePoint Online. So first, just to sort of level set, just so that folks sort of understand, okay, what is Azure websites and where does it fit into sort of the breadth of product offerings from Microsoft. So Windows Azure as a cloud service has grown substantially over the previous years. It started out initially with cloud services, so those were web roles and worker roles, sometimes referred to as platform as a service. And it gives you the ability to stand up and run both lights out code as well as websites, go run it on our scalable cloud infrastructure. You get full access to sort of installing software on it, getting RDP access to the VMs, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the big benefits, though, along with the automatic scaling, is also the ability to have us automatically manage the VMs for you. So, for example, patching just happens behind the scenes automatically. You don't have to sit there mucking around with Windows Update and worrying about whether or not this month or this Tuesday's patch has been applied. Now, having it said that, we introduced earlier this year virtual machine hosting, which is sometimes referred to as infrastructure as a service on Windows Azure, and that's much more traditionally aligned with what everyone is familiar with, which is running VMs on hardware, or in this case, you're running the VMs on the Windows Azure cloud infrastructure. And so, of course, the advantage there is it very neatly aligns with probably what many of you are running in your companies and organizations today. But by the same token, it does mean the onus is on you to do all of the management and the setup and the configuration of the VMs. And then finally, we come to Azure Websites, which is also a new offering that was introduced this year. That's the team I come from. And we're focused on a very specific scenario and audience, which is making it really easy to develop modern, scalable websites and get them up and running very quickly in the cloud. And the way we do that is by basically hiding and abstracting away a lot of the management and setup and configuration work that you otherwise have to sort of assume if you're going to be going with cloud services or virtual machines. So there are a couple of sort of core tenets about what we try to make sure we enable for all of you of our customers on Azure websites. The most critical one is to make it really simple to get started. We don't want you to have to read a 600-page book and figure out the ins and outs of some new architecture. We just want to say, look, if you're running websites today on your laptop, on a machine under your desk, at your company, you name it, we want to have a very, very simple and easy on-ramp to be able to take that exact same code base and get it up and running in the cloud. And I'll actually show you here in a bit, walk you through some very straightforward scenarios of getting up and running quickly. And literally, it's a couple of mouse clicks on a website, and you can be up and running, basically in under a minute. Now, having it said that, it's great to have a really simple on-ramp and get up and running quickly, but we also want to make sure that you can run really heavy-duty workloads on the Azure website service. So again, I will show you this in a few minutes with some of the demo sites we have, how you can go out, for example, and scale across multiple instances. You can also go ahead and move up to higher tiers of for-pay offerings with something called reserved instances, where you can get entire virtual machine resources dedicated to running your websites. So basically, the idea is you start out simple, but we make it very easy for you to scale out and scale up. In terms of the breadth of the programming languages and frameworks that we support, our aim is to be able to support everything that you could do today on a standard Windows web server. So we support the standard inbox Windows app frameworks. That's classic ASP and ASP.NET. And then additionally, we also automatically support PHP for Windows. We've supported the Node.js for Windows now for a few months. And then we also support Python. Currently, I believe it's called Bring Your Own Python, but you can basically download Python, upload it to a website running on Azure websites, and you're off to the races. In terms of back-end databases, we support SQL Azure, so that has a lot of symmetry, of course, with the on-prem SQL Server product. And also, we support MySQL running up in Azure. So you can go out and set up, for example, a PHP app running on Windows, and you can go ahead and purchase MySQL databases to run as your back end. You'll see a little bit of it later on in the talk. We have an app gallery that's wired up, probably not directly of interest for folks in this audience, but it helps for people who just want to get up and running with, for example, WordPress or .NET Nuke. You can actually go to a gallery, click through a couple of sign-up links, and we will automatically deploy the base application for you, provision it, and just get it up and running, running on the Azure website service. So again, it's all about sort of reducing that friction and making it very easy for folks to get up and running. And then in terms of development environments and development tools, we of course have great support and great integration with Visual Studio and with Web Matrix. However, at the end of the day, everything that goes on Azure websites, both in terms of management API calls, as well as actually pushing content up into the cloud. It uses a combination of REST APIs over HTTP, and we support FTP as a publishing protocol. So you can absolutely whip out a Mac, fire up an open source code editor, and happily sit there and start coding and uploading code over FTP and running it on our cloud infrastructure. And then lastly, again, not the focus of this talk, but just mainly so that you're aware of it, we have great integration with both open source and Microsoft source code control products. I'll actually show you a brief walkthrough of Git in a few minutes. We also support TFS, the hosted TFS that runs in the cloud. What's great about that is, again, if you have a more rigorous development process where you put your code under regular control and you want to build and then release it up into the cloud, you can do that using both TFS and Git. And then also, again, in a few minutes I'll touch on it, we do collect a lot of logging information and diagnostics information as your sites are running. So you do have access to, for example, W3C HTTP usage logs that you can pull down yourselves and do all kinds of slicing and dicing and analysis on. And then we also keep track of sort of the various canonical resource utilization, so you can see how much CPU time or how much network egress your website has been consuming. So with that very quick overview, probably the fastest way to get sort of folks up to speed is just to try it out and give you a walkthrough of it. So what I have running up on the screen right now is the HTML-based Azure portal. I've already logged in with one of my live IDs, and what you're seeing right now is down the left-hand side of the screen is actually a variety of the Windows Azure services that are available to all of us, though the focus for us today in this talk is specifically on websites. But you can see down the left-hand side, like I said, there's a breadth of functionality that's available in Azure, and we are just one of many services that are running up in the cloud. So in terms of like how quickly you can get up and running with a website, I'll briefly touch on what I had mentioned earlier, which was we have an application gallery where you can say, hey, I'd like to get up and running with a website, and for example, maybe I don't actually want to write code, maybe I'm not a developer, for example, and so I want to go out and create an application directly from our application gallery. And so in my case, I'm not going to walk through installing an app here live, but just so that you're aware of it, you can see we have a variety of open source apps. So we have the popular WordPress app for PHP, a lot of well-known content management systems for .NET, .NET Nuke, et cetera. And then if you go ahead and you choose to install one of these, when you click through, it will go ahead and walk you through a wizard that asks you for a variety of config info. It can actually auto-provision databases for you, and then blammo, you're up and running in about a minute or two. But in our case, let's just start out with a blank website. So once again, I'll go to website, say quick create, and we'll just give it some random name. So foo123, we'll say great, let's go create that website. So what's happening in the background right now is live, is Windows Azure is going out. It's going to a specific data center, in this case, in the Western US region. It's created some location on disk where we can go out and store our website content. And it's also gone out and provisioned a basic DNS name so that we can actually access it. So there we go. That's the site that we just created. If we take a look, you can see, sure enough, there's foo123. And by default, we create you under the Azure Websites.net domain because that's our subdomain that the entire Azure Website service runs under. So, great. I've got a blank website, but that's not particularly interesting. So, what I'm going to do is click in to one of the pages where I can scroll around and do some management tasks. And again, I'll be sort of popping around some of the different features here in the portal, but for now I just wanted to call your attention to what's here on the right-hand side of the screen. And you'll see that, for example, if we purchased hosted TFS in the cloud, we could actually hook up a TFS-hosted project to my website and be able to do things like deploy directly from TFS in the cloud right into the Azure Websites infrastructure. In my case, just because there are a couple of fewer steps up front, I'm going to use the open source Git product. And I'm going to say I would like you to go out and configure some things for my site so that I can make use of it with Git. And so, okay, it takes a few seconds. Again, it sets up some extra directories up in the cloud because those are used as repositories for Git. And the thing I want to copy and paste out here of the browser is the special URL that I need to be able to hook up my client here on my laptop and go connect to Git in the cloud. So I will now say git remote add, give it a name, and I'll pop in that URL. So I'll go paste that in. And now what I should be able to do is go push what is my very rudimentary website sitting here on my laptop and push it in real time up into my website that's running in the cloud. So underneath the hood, right, one of the many ways Git can communicate is over HTTP. So as you can imagine, basically I've got the Git client on my laptop, makes an HTTP connection to our Git endpoint running up in the Azure Website Service, and then just source code control commands flow back and forth between my laptop and Azure Websites. So let's come back here, hit refresh real quickly, and okay, great, sure enough, it looks like I changed the default home page of my site. And then if I take that a little bit further, so let's go over to the exciting website directory I've got here on my laptop, and we'll go ahead and make a quick edit. So welcome to SPC 2012. So here I am, I'm a developer. I'm making some changes on my local machine. And we'll go out and commit that to my local repository. And then I will re-push the changes up to Azure. Oop, well, assuming I can remember my password, we will push my changes up to Azure. All right. Come on, third time's the charm. Yep. Okay. Trust me, I really do remember what my password is. There we go. So it chugs on through there, successfully uploads it, and if I hit refresh, you can see when I refresh the page, sure enough, the change has automatically been committed, so I just synchronized from the source code running on my machine and got it pushed up there into the cloud. So again, very simple example, but it's meant to sort of drive home the point that the Azure Website Service, it's not about having CSPKGs and hosted service models. It's about you, the developer, going out and working on a website and iteratively making edits and changes, pushing them up to the cloud, seeing how they run, make more changes, push them up to the cloud over and over and over again. So a very fast, very rapid, very easy development cycle. Okay, so that was a simple website using Git. Oh, and one last thing. Just because I happen to still have been parked on the page, the folks who built the Git integration, and this is also true for the TFS integration, you can actually see here in real time, the portal was picking up the notifications of the pushes I was doing from my laptop up to the cloud. So you can actually see the initial setup and then you can see the changes that I just pushed up there a minute ago. So there's a lot of rich functionality that we actually have built into the source code control options that we have with the Azure Web Sites product. Okay, so let's create another website, and we'll call it SCH Foo Bakery, because probably no one's taken that. And this time around, I'm going to put it in East US. So this is just more sort of to show you, hey, you do have locations around the world. So where Windows Azure exists around the world, the Azure Web Sites product exists. And so depending upon whether you're US, Asia, Europe, you can pick the geography that you want, and you can go ahead and create your websites in any of those. So for the heck of it, let's go to East US. So we'll let that chug through for a little bit, take a few seconds to set up. And what I'm going to do with this website is I'm going to instead use Web Matrix. So this is one of the standalone web development tools that we have. So it's a little bit smaller, slimmed down vis-a-vis Visual Studio, but it's free. You can download it, run it on relatively low hardware requirements, and it's specifically meant to appeal to a broader audience. So right now I have one of the default template sites sitting here running on my machine. Again, if we zoom it in, you can see currently this site is running on localhost, so it's running on my laptop. And what we will want to do is get this site pushed up and running in the cloud. So let's go back to our portal. There's my Foo Bakery site. I'm going to make one quick change while this is while we're running through things. I'm going to real quickly turn on W3C logging and go save that change. And don't worry, I'll come back to the configure page in a little bit just so that you can sort of see the flavor of the kinds of things that you can change. And then I will come back to my primary page. And what I want to do this time around is you can see here on the right-hand side, there's a link called Download Publish Profile. And what this is a pre-generated XML file that has credentials and network endpoints that I can use with tools like Visual Studio and like Web Matrix so that they can just automatically connect into the Azure Web Sites service and enable me to publish content again from my local machine up into the cloud. So we'll go here and we'll click the Publish button. Now in my case, I haven't published this site before for my laptop. So the first thing Web Matrix asks me is, hey, you got to give me some info. And I can actually, for example, sign up for Azure Web Sites from scratch if I wanted to from here. But in my case, since I've already got things up and running, we'll go to the desktop and we'll go to the Foo Bakery settings file that I just downloaded. See, a bunch of info gets pre-populated, but again, you don't have to worry about that. You just select the file, pull it in, and it will do two things. First, Web Matrix does some checks to make sure that the guy on the other side of that web deploy publishing link can actually run the thing I'm going to publish. And in this case, I can. And then I'll hit continue, and it detects the fact that, well, guess what? There's really nothing out there, so I basically have a lot of files to go upload. And at this point, it'll just sit here and spin for a little bit down here at the bottom while it's happily publishing all the files from my laptop up into the cloud. Now, this is actually yet another avenue for getting content both up and down from the websites, right? You saw Git, we touched on TFS. This right now is using Web Deploy, which is an HTTP-based protocol that has some bells and whistles around it that help tools like Web Matrix and Visual Studio to do things like diffing and actually do more extensive configuration, for example, up in the endpoint in the cloud. And then lastly, we also support FTP because, again, pretty much everybody on the planet has access to some kind of an FTP tool or another, and that's the way that universally we can allow anyone, whether you're on Unix or Mac or on Windows, to be able to go publish content up into the Azure Web Site service. So in this case, it's a couple of meg overall, and it looks like I don't exactly have the greatest network connection, so it's still chugging along a little bit, and we'll come back to it in a sec once it's done. What I wanted to do while we wait is let's go find that file I just downloaded. Let's pop it open, and let's do something else with it. Let's also get myself set up so that I can go use, in my case, FileZilla, an open source FTP tool. So, and again, use your whatever tool you've got that you like, command line or UI. But you can see that I'm pulling the username and some very long randomly generated password out of the configuration settings. And I'm going to go out and connect up literally into Azure. And you can see here, I'm now parked in a view where I can see my dub root. And you can see it's already begun to get populated with content that I'm currently publishing here out of the Web Matrix tool. Now, again, normally, like if you do this from, for example, home or from your corporation or business, it'll go a lot faster. And I apologize, there seem to have been some glitches with networking here at the talk, so it seems to be taking a little bit longer. But eventually, once everything is published up here, then we can go out and actually run the site and make use of it. So, good, it's gotten into the content. So I'll tell you what, we'll hop back to the portal and temporarily just take a quick look at some of the information you get when you're running a site. So you notice there are all these green sort of text here with numbers and information. These are keeping track of the resource metrics that we in Windows Azure actually look at, both from the point of view of trying to minimize things like bad neighbor effect, and also from the point of view of things that ultimately, if you move to a for-pay offering, we will bill you for. So you can see that we have 2 sets of CPU time that we keep track of. And again, there are different limits depending upon whether or not you're running in a free or a pay mode. Remember, this is a site I just created here on stage. So this is actually a freebie site. You don't pay a dime for what you're seeing here. We keep track of network egress. And so again, for a free site, you get about 165 meg of free egress a day. And then we also give you some storage, in this case, a gigabyte of storage. And we also keep track of the maximum amount of memory you're using. And so we have a limit of a gig that we keep track of over the course of an hour. So let's, again, take a quick peek back here at Web Matrix. All right, excellent. Looks like the publishing is completed. So we'll go ahead, click the link, and we'll let the service fire up the website. And so sure enough, this time around, I'm running that same website we saw a few minutes ago. But now if you look at the URL, right, that's actually running up in Azure Websites under our domain. Again, other than the slowness on the network, didn't take any more than a few minutes and a couple of mouse clicks through Web Matrix to get this up and running. So I'm going to hit refresh a few times, just click around a little bit, just to have it doing something. Basically, I want to see if I can generate enough traffic to see when I go back to the portal, if I can get a little bit of usage information showing up here in the graph. And so, of course, because we just created the site, it's sort of squashed off there on the side. But you can see that we have I wouldn't call it real time, but it's sort of almost real-time tracking of your resource utilization. And it's not just for us to go out and do quota enforcement or billing. It's also so that you as the customer can say, oh, well, look, looks like 22K of incoming network utilization, looks like about 1/4 of a meg egress, and I've already done 30 requests. And then you also have it here in tabular form as well that you can keep track of. Now, what I'm wondering is, for the heck of it, let's go out and refresh our connection here in FileZilla to the FTP endpoint. Okay, so I can see that a lot more content now is actually showing up here. So I can see everything that I just uploaded. I'm going to navigate up the directory hierarchy a bit. And you can see there's this log files directory. And if I drill into it a little bit, all right, great. So this is the second piece that I was hoping things had sort of kicked in quickly enough. This is a filtered set of W3 HTTP usage logs. And again, I mean, all of you work with websites, so it should be pretty familiar to you, right? This is your canonical W3C log, what verbs, what URLs, it has all the usual information, what were the response codes, inbound, outbound usage, all that. So the nice thing about this is we have running as a service that all of you get in Azure Websites, a watcher that looks at the continuous stream of HTTP usage logs coming off of our web servers, and we're able to sort of slice that up so we can filter it and get it for your site versus yours, et cetera, et cetera. And then we automatically place it here out on the content directories so you can get to it through FTP. And again, for folks who are interested in it, we recommend that you download it, maybe once a day, pull down the logs, delete what's up there so we can continue generating new logs. And then from there, again, run your favorite, analysis tools, et cetera, against the usage logs. So a couple of other things since we've been popping in and out of the portal that I wanted to touch on. So I'd sort of zoomed past the configure tab earlier because I wanted to sort of get the HTTP logging turned on early to see if we could get some usage to show up. So a couple of things, again, a lot of this should be familiar to you with your backgrounds, right? .NET Framework versions. So we currently support now both 3.5 and .NET Framework 4.5. A few weeks ago it was only 4.0, but we didn't upgrade to bring it up to date with 4.5. So you've got the two major frameworks available. If PHP is more your flavor, currently it's 5.3. However, we will be applying an upgrade rather shortly to the service and adding 5.4. So don't worry, it's almost but not quite here. We come down here to domain names. You'll notice right now this whole section, it's all read-only. Again, this is a free site. So with a free site, the only thing you specifically get is you only get to name sort of the suffix port, or excuse me, the prefix portion of the URL. But if you move to a for pay offering, there's sort of two general tiers of pay offerings. And if you go to an external domain registrar and get your own custom host name, or for that matter in the plural, host names, you can go ahead and CNAME your own host names, point them at the name that's been generated here for the Azure website site, and then from there, just give your customers the friendly host names that you've gone out and purchased. And what we do behind the scenes is we register in our system the host names, so when the HTTP requests come in, we actually recognize that, oh, guess what? This random host name, Pepsi.com, is actually running on our sites, and we know how to go out and route it. A couple of other quick things. So diagnostics, you saw what the web server logging option does. We have it off by default just because it does generate some disk I/O and it does generate files. So if you do turn it on, you do want to periodically pull down the files and delete them. We do that mainly as a sort of courtesy measure because otherwise, right, you just have logs that grow and grow and grow and grow, and then you run out of disk space. The other two features, error messages and failed request tracing, these are referencing an IIS feature. There's a detailed error logging feature in IIS that this one turns on, and the other one, if you've heard of it, it's sometimes referred to as FREB, or failed request event tracing. So this is where you can turn on the FREB feature in IIS, and you can get those log files just the way I got the HTTP logs. You hook up with FTP, pull them down, and you can go out and analyze them. There's this interesting section, app settings and connection strings. So for all of us who use the .NET Framework, these map directly to the app settings and connection strings values that you know from managed configuration. And I'll actually come back here in a second. We'll play around a little bit with app settings. And then lastly, you can see here default docs. Again, should be very familiar to you if you work with IIS. You can go ahead and trim this list down, customize it, you name it, and set up whatever you want for the default handling for the default doc. So what I wanted to do with app settings, in this case, let's just pull in a specific setting. So just type in some text. Hello, SharePoint conference. We'll go out and save that. And what happens is both sets of these key value pairs, if you provide them, we store them in our configuration databases, and we associate it with your website. And the cool thing is at runtime, when we run your website, we pull these values out of our configuration database, and we make it available to you as a developer. And specifically in the case of .NET Framework, we do a little bit of extra syntactical magic. And what we actually do is literally we pull the app settings values that you see here, and we stick them into the managed configuration systems collection of app settings. And it's the same thing for connection strings. If you happen to be running a .NET Framework app, ASP.NET, we will pull these key values out, and at runtime, we will populate the connection string section in the .NET configuration system. So to give you an idea of that, let's come back here to our little bakery site, go to a page, go to the About page, and I'll throw in a little snippet of code here. So we'll say, great, let's go define a variable, and I'll go use the ASP.NET Configuration Manager. I'll go to App Settings. I'll say, let's go give me that foo value. Then, oh, by the way, I'll account for the case that there was nothing actually specified. And then we'll go throw it out and actually print it out on the page for us. So, okay, nice simple change. First, let's go out and run this thing locally. So right now, the page you're seeing, this is the site running on my laptop, right? It's running on IS Express. Okay, now let's close out this publishing session. Let's set up a new publishing connection. This time around, because we're using Web Deploy, it's able to do the diff between what's on my machine versus what's in the cloud. And you can see it's much smaller, so it's smart enough to realize one and only one page changed. So we'll go out, let it connect. Great. So now I should be in the browser window for my Azure Websites-based version of the Bakery app. Go ahead and refresh it so it comes back up again. And then once it comes back, okay, tell you what, let's try that one more time. And we don't need the localhost version. Okay, so there we are, and let's click About Us. And you can see this time around, it automatically pulled the value out of our configuration database. And it's basically as simple as that. One of the things we sort of expect developers to use this feature for is, for example, if you have like connection strings, connection info to various assets up in the cloud, maybe blob storage connection strings, SQL Azure connection strings, things like that. One of the great things about this is, A, you don't have to worry about rigging it through your build system or your build environment and sort of tearing your hair out and saying, oh man, that website that I'm pushing up to Azure, did I remember to put the right values in web config? Go ahead and put the values in there in the portal, and we'll make sure they're the correct ones every single time. The other nice thing is there's a side security benefit, which is, like I said, at runtime, we're doing something on the fly to make these values visible to the .NET framework. We don't actually write it to your web config file. So if you're concerned about, it's a secret, and for example, maybe you have compliance requirements where there are questions about like, well, why are you putting maybe a blob connection string inside a web config? You don't have to. You can put it into our app setting and connection strings up in the portal. We actually store it as encrypted values in our databases, so we store it quite securely, and that way it never actually shows up in the contents or in the file system of your web app. Okay, so we've gone through a couple of different ways of working with the apps in Azure Websites. Probably the last thing I should actually touch on here are our scale capabilities. So you can see here the site, the Foo Bakery site I just created. It starts out in free mode by default. Even for running in free mode, we do have the ability to increase or decrease the number of instances that we're willing to run. And what this means is that, for example, if I set this to running 3 instances of this bakery site, we will actually, behind the scenes, as sort of the load goes up on the system, we will spin up 3 worker processes on 3 completely different pieces of hardware and run your site. Now, having it said that, for the free tier, it's not particularly useful simply because you would probably, if you were actually running like that much load that you could cause us to spin up 3 instances, you'd probably end up hitting like your network egress quota or maybe your CPU quota. But it becomes a lot more useful when, for example, you go to either the paid the paid tier that's called paid shared, or you move up to reserved. So let me touch on what's involved with these. Shared, as the name implies, it is a for-pay feature, but you are running on a same set of shared servers as everyone else. So the reason why it's for pay is that, for example, if I go out and save this change, we'll give it a couple of seconds to chug through. I'll flip back over to the configuration page, and I'll show you that the host name section has now become editable, and I can actually add domain names. So right here's domain names. If you look down here in the toolbar, the ribbon bar at the bottom, I can now click on the Manage Domains button, And I can go through, if I actually had domain names set up with an external registrar, I could register one or more CNAMEs and have those pointing back here to my site running on Azure websites. So that's actually one of the motivations for running in paid shared mode. Another motivation for running in paid shared mode is that when we go to the resources that are available, so what we saw on this page, you might not notice it, it's a little bit subtle, but there's actually fewer bars showing here. Specifically, the network egress resource bar just disappeared. And the reason why is when you're in a for pay tier, we don't throttle or prevent you from using more network usage. You still get 165 meg outbound per day for free, but anything above that limit, we just start metering, and then you'll get a bill in a month's time. And so there's no cap on network egress. The other thing, it's a little bit more subtle, but we actually give you higher limits in terms of CPU time. And behind the scenes, we will actually keep your website up and running for longer. For free offers, we will go out and actually idle you out pretty aggressively. Again, it's free. We do want you to try out the service, but by the same token, we can't sit there and burn up resources at the expense of the for pay customers. But for paid shared, we will keep you in memory. I think it's for an hour, even if you've been idle. Now, there's another option for scaling that you can use, and that's sort of the granddaddy of it, which is you go to reserved mode. Reserved, as the name implies, means we actually reserve one or more virtual machines that are exclusively dedicated in the cloud for running your websites. And just as with the other options, right, you can choose number of instances to go up to. And just quick FYI, today, because we're in preview, it just happens to be capped at 3. We will down the road be removing, or if nothing else, bumping that limit up substantially. So that's just sort of an artifact of the fact that we're in preview mode. And then you can also tell us the specific VM size that you want to use for your reserved instances. And so if you're familiar with Windows Azure, these map one-to-one to the small, medium, and large VM sizes that are available today elsewhere in Azure. So for example, if I were to go out and choose this combination, so reserved, running on large VM, 3 instances, we will, behind the scenes, go into our cluster of servers. We will mark 3 large VMs exclusively for your use, and then we will run only your website or websites on those 3 virtual machines. And so that's meant to give you the maximum amount of scaling and also give you the opportunity to get off the shared servers, running on your own dedicated servers. And at that point, we also no longer watch your CPU utilization or your memory utilization. At this point, they're your VMs. If you want to go run them hot at 100% CPU load and 90% memory load, more power to you. They're all dedicated for your usage. So of course, in this case, I'm actually going to click off from the page. But what I will do, actually, is in a little bit here, we're going to be working with one of the other sites that I have set up for integrating with SharePoint. So I'm actually going to take my little dev site here, and I will flip it up to paid shared mode, because I'd like to actually keep it up and running in memory. So we'll make that change real quickly. And then, not that it's particularly earth-shattering, but for grins, let's go ahead and take a look at my staggeringly huge bill from the last week of playing around with paid shared sites. So I probably haven't logged in there for a bit, so it's wondering who I am. So I'm currently using the 3-month free trial that's out there for everyone to use. And you can see literally just for me, in the past few days, I had a few of these sites running for I don't know, 2 hours or so, say, in paid shared mode, and it's cost me a whopping total of 4 cents. The reason why I show that to you, though, is, again, it may not be immediately obvious, but this scaling mode, you can scale up and you can scale down at will. So again, scenario-wise, if you know, hey, Christmas is coming up, I don't feel comfortable with running my, maybe I have a basic e-commerce site, I'm not going to run it paid shared, great. You can go reserved, put it on 1 or more VMs, run it that way for 3 weeks, Christmas rush is done, great, come on back to the portal, scale back down to paid shared. And you only pay for the utilization for that peak period when you went ahead and purchased the additional resources. So So very cool, very useful scaling option. Okay, so I think that is the whirlwind tour of Windows Azure websites, just purely from the Azure websites perspective. Now I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about, well, we got Windows Azure, we've got SharePoint Online and Office 365. How can you bring sort of those two worlds together? So very briefly, as you've probably seen a lot of today and also over the past 2 days here at the conference, the SharePoint folks have invested a lot of time and effort to open up their application development model with the new version of SharePoint. And it's actually great from our point of view in Azure websites because it means that the kinds of developers who are comfortable building, for example, ASP.NET websites, maybe from scratch, maybe getting them from third parties, using the tool sets that are out there, and sort of the assumptions that those developers have about all of the functionality that's available to them. Well, guess what? You can now build those kinds of websites and actually integrate them into the SharePoint experience and read and write data with SharePoint. And that's actually something that's been a lot more difficult to do in the past. So previously, right, for SharePoint 07, you had a model where, well, you built a SharePoint app, but it was actually code running inside of SharePoint. And then iterated on things a bit, and they introduced a sandboxing model to give you more flexibility about the kind of code you could write. But again, you were still running within the scope of the SharePoint sandbox. And with 2013, they've basically eliminated those boundaries. And in a sense, they've taken SharePoint and they've turned it into a big business engine that's front-ended by a REST API. And I shouldn't say a REST API. I mean like a bunch of functionality exposed through REST endpoints. And at that point, right, it's a bunch of APIs. Anyone can call them. You can go ahead and do all kinds of interactions and call all kinds of functionality inside of SharePoint 13 using their REST interfaces. And so for us in Azure websites, that means you can go out and build and deploy websites, go run them up in Windows Azure, hook them up to SharePoint, and start reading and writing and trading data back and forth between your completely custom-built website and SharePoint. So what does that mean sort of formally in terms of the terminology of the app models? What we're going to talk to here today is the one on the bottom, the provider-hosted app model. That's the model where it's you bring your own website, develop whatever you want, write whatever you want. You go ahead and you register the site with SharePoint, and then from there you start using the development tools that are available in Visual Studio to provide the hooks that make your site visible inside of the SharePoint UI, and then furthermore, write the code inside of your website that can call into and interact with SharePoint. Now, the other two models, probably all of you are familiar with the SharePoint hosted model. Auto-hosted is another new model that's been introduced with the new version of SharePoint. There was actually, I think, a talk yesterday from one of my peers up in Redmond, Maxim, on the auto-hosted apps. Auto-hosted apps it's a lot like provider-hosted in the sense that, once again, you can write whatever kind of web code that you want. You can have websites that render whatever you want. But the sort of subtle difference is you upload that into SharePoint in Office 365, and they actually take care of all of the provisioning. They take care of running it for you on their own web clusters. They basically take 100% of the administration and management and completely take it out of your hands. And that's actually great for a wide array of applications where you as a customer may not want to have to muck around with or worry about the vagaries of running a website. But if you're into running your own websites, or if you're a third party or an ISV and you have a relatively complicated web service or website that you want to integrate with SharePoint, provider-hosted apps are definitely something that you should look at. So quick graphical overview, and I will actually walk through this with you in a second. We basically end up doing two things when we write a provider-hosted app. We go ahead and we register some information about the app with SharePoint. We then actually take like the web app, the thing that's going to run, and we go deploy it somewhere, in this case, up into Azure websites. And then once that happens, the code running inside of that Azure websites app can make all kinds of REST API calls into SharePoint Online and get full access to the functionality that's available there. And then similarly, using some other advanced functionality called event receivers, you can actually configure SharePoint Online to call back into your web app that's running out there on Windows Azure. And for example, you can have SharePoint notify you that maybe someone added an item to a document list, as an example. So with that brief walkthrough of sort of the integration options, I'll shift back to my laptop. And what we'll do now is let's get out of the current variations of the Bakery app. Just close down a few windows. And what we'll do instead is switch on over to Visual Studio. So we'll close out a web matrix there. Great. So I already have set up here the basics of a provider-hosted app inside of Visual Studio. You can see here on the right-hand side in the Solution Explorer, I have 2 projects that are in my solution. I have my Bakery web app, and again, I'm intentionally using that app because it's about as far removed as SharePoint as I could think of, and we're actually going to help tie it in and integrate it with SharePoint. And then we have a second project, and this is the project that we use to go tell SharePoint, in essence, about how we want my web app to integrate and work with it. So right now, of course, I don't actually have the integration points hooked up. So for example, I have a demo developer tenancy running up here in SharePoint Online. I do happen to have already registered just the basics of the app. I have it sitting here in my available apps. But what I want to do is sort of integrate it more tightly in a few places. So first off, in the document library, what I want to do is I want to be able to go to this context menu, and when I drill into it, I'd like to actually have a menu option here that will launch me from my document library into my application that's running out in Azure websites. And then similarly, for the heck of it, I'd also like to see if I could get that same kind of linking working here in the ribbon bar of the document library. And then for the last sort of basic integration that I'm going to go for, here on my home page of my tenancy, right, when I go into edit mode and I want to add some web parts, what I would like to do is I would like to be able to add what's called an app part, which is a kind of sort of a flavor of web part, as it were, and I'd like to actually add it into the view of my page here. So let's go ahead and hop out of that. That's right. Not making any changes, so we will flip back to Visual Studio. So the first thing I'm going to do is add what's called a menu item into my SharePoint site. So let's call this Bakery menu item. And you can see here that I'm using a variety of parts and items that are in the SharePoint project type. So I'm using the menu item custom action. And when I choose that, well, the first thing it's going to realize is it's been a while since I've logged in. So I'll have to hook myself back up. So VS connects up to SharePoint. It confirms the fact that, yeah, great, I can actually write an app that's going to integrate with this site. And what I want to do is I want to say, hey, my menu item is going to have something to do with the document library. So now I need to give it some information. So first off, I will go ahead and say, hey, let's go buy some cake. So that's the text that's going to show up on the menu item. And then I actually need to give it some code, or in this case specifically a URL that it can go to. So again, I'm going to copy the URL to my site that's running up in Azure. Let's zoom in a bit to see what it's pointing at. So you can see that I'm telling SharePoint that when I click on a specific portion of the SharePoint UI, what it's going to do actually is navigate out to a site running in Azure websites. And then I have this placeholder value, standard tokens, which is just a way of telling SharePoint, oh, by the way, when you actually navigate the user from SharePoint over to my site, please pass along the sort of standard set of key value information that the website might find to be useful. So we'll go ahead and finish that. And I will make 2 quick modifications here. In this case, the menu item is very simple, so there's not a whole heck of a lot of metadata. The one thing I'm doing here is I'm changing the sequence number, and that will have the effect of making sure my menu item sort of pops up to the very top of the menu item list. And then I've just got one little bug here I need to work around, which is I don't want to over-encode the braces on my standard tokens. So great. At this point, I've added the metadata to my SharePoint project that says, go create me a menu item that links me off to my web app. So let's do a similar thing and go add a button in that ribbon. So this is going to be a bakery ribbon item. Same general idea. All right, so this time around, what am I doing? Well, I'm still working with the document library, but in this case, I want to manipulate that toolbar ribbon that you saw at the top. So it's going to ask me for a little bit of extra information saying, well, where exactly do you want me to be customizing the ribbon? So in this case, I'm saying I want you to go to the portion of the ribbon that deals with adding new documents, and that's where I want you to make some space so that I can actually link out to this app running in Azure websites. So great, let's go say celebrate for the text, because I want to celebrate with cake. And once again, right, I'm going to my site running out in Azure websites, and once again saying, please give me the standard set of tokens. So we'll go ahead and finish. And the one modification I want to make here, other than the quick fix-up, just go ahead and put in standard braces, not URL encoding. And I want to go out and supply some custom images. And there's a reason why I'm doing this. So the reason why I put in these two URLs to images is if you look closely, you'll see these are actually pointing at URLs inside of my website. So actually what I'm doing is I'm going to tell SharePoint that inside of the SharePoint rendered ribbon bar that it should actually get the iconography for my website from something outside of SharePoint. Namely, I'm telling SharePoint, you should reach out back into me, and I'll give you the actual icons that I want you to show up there. And so that's actually a little subtle, but it's an interesting point because, hey, I'm the one developing the website. Maybe I've got some designers. I can go have them design whatever I want, and it's going to show up seamlessly and fit right in there into the general flow of the SharePoint UI. So it makes for a very nice UI experience. So great, we'll go out and save that. And so far, we've been sort of linking in things that are just, hey, a menu here, a ribbon button there. We'll do something a little bit crazier, and we'll add in a client web part. Now, a client web part it's not like a full-blown web part that's inside of SharePoint where all the definition and the functionality is inside of SharePoint. What it is it's you carving out a part of the UI, much like you do with other web parts, but the actual rendering, the text, the images, you name it, they don't come from SharePoint, they come from my website. And sort of what it's called or referred to sometimes as a client web part or sometimes referred to as an application part. So, okay, I think I want to call this app part bakery. So go out and add that. And in this case, I have a slightly different URL that I want to pop in. So go ahead and pop that in there and take a quick look at it. So you'll notice this time around, instead of pointing at just sort of like the home page of my site, I'm actually pointing at a specific page in my site that is going to render information, and that info is going to show up very seamlessly inside of the SharePoint UI as if it were just another part of the overall rendering that SharePoint was creating for you. And again, we'll go ahead and say, please give me the standard tokens. So, okay, a couple of things here we want to tweak up before we quickly put together some code for it. So let's see, title looks pretty boring, so this is actually going to show up as a piece of link text inside of SharePoint. So I'll give it something nice, Fourth Coffee, because that's the name of the mythical coffee site. And we'll give it some text, so when you hover over it, you get some info. And in my case, I'm going to tell SharePoint that the content I'm providing is going to be specifically 150 pixels wide and 150 pixels high. So it's now, of course, incumbent upon me as the website developer to make sure that the output of this CSHTML page actually renders cleanly within that screen real estate. But that's okay. We've got that covered. So I'm going to in VS now switch over to my web project, and we will add an HTML, actually a CSHTML page, and I think we wanted to call it, is it app part CSHTML? So we'll go out and add that. And again, just in the interest of time, because it would take me forever and a day to type this stuff, we'll pop in a very simple custom rendering. So in this case, I'm just going to emit a pre-built, in my case, an image that's 150 pixels wide, 150 pixels high. However, to drive home the point, this is a CSHTML page, aka Razor syntax from ASP.NET Land. You can go ahead and write whatever you want in this page. You can render whatever you want, and it will get written back and show up right inside of SharePoint. So if you want, the canonical reporting, stock quotes, et cetera, you can go ahead and build all that custom off to the side, wrap it up as an app part, and have the rendering of that information show up inside of your SharePoint environment. Now, there's one interesting thing I'm doing here in terms of the layout, is I happen to be referencing a CSS class that does not exist inside of my bakery website. This is actually one of many CSS classes that SharePoint provides that give you, the web developer, the ability to create a custom look and feel, but a look and feel that's also consistent with what the SharePoint UI looks like. So in order to make sure I get that pulled into my site, let's go ahead and set up this layout page. So Razor has this concept of you can have the main rendering of the page, and then you can also have stuff that it pulls in. So again, we'll just pull in this code, drop it in, and let me talk to it real briefly. Basically, all I'm doing is I'm looking at the URL that's coming into my web app. So I'm in SharePoint, I'm going to click the app part, SharePoint's going to redirect out to my site running an Azure website, and I'm going to get this, big URL query string stuff. And remember, we had that placeholder earlier, standard tokens. Well, one of the key value pairs that SharePoint will happily provide for me is a URL that points back into SharePoint. And in my case, since this code is running up in Azure, I'm going to use that to build up a CSS style sheet reference that says, hey, when I'm rendering this page, why don't you go back to SharePoint and, in this case, drill down to a well-known location and the CSS handler, and what I will actually get back when the page is rendering in the browser is all the custom CSS types and styles that SharePoint knows about. And then because of that, included in that, this MS emphasis style, or this class, will actually be available for me to use in my web app. So I think I've hooked up everything I wanted to for the near term. What I'm going to do first off is I'm going to publish my web app back up into Azure websites. So once again, I happen to be using web deploy. This time it happens to be from inside of Visual Studio. So we'll go ahead and publish it. Since I've already got the site up there, it shouldn't have to push everything. It'll just push the recompiled DLL and some of the changes I made. So we'll let that sit there and chug along for a little bit. And then once that actually completes, we will shift gears and go over to the SharePoint portion of the solution and update that inside of SharePoint. All right, great. So that tells me it succeeded, and it's trying to run the site now, which for now is not particularly interesting. So let's hop over here in the Solution Explorer to the SharePoint portion, and I'm going to deploy my changes up into SharePoint. Because, right, I made changes to the website, I made changes to my SharePoint app. So I got to push the SharePoint changes to Office 365, and I got to go push the website changes up into Windows Azure. So we'll let that chug along for a little bit. While that's grinding through there, I'm going to cancel out of this because I haven't clicked through it yet. And it tells me this app is not installed on this site, which makes me worried. Dun, dun, dun. All right. So let's see here. I am in the demo site, and I do have, go back to the site. All right. So that's interesting. Well, let's give it a whirl. See what it says in the output. I'm wondering why it was thinking that it was not there, but okay. So it's good that it's moving to the installation step, which is what we wanted it to. Yay, the app has been installed up in SharePoint. Okay, so the first thing that happens after I refresh the app inside of SharePoint is, and like you've seen this before with, for example, Windows 8 apps and other mobile phone apps, is it's going to ask me and say, well, do you really trust this app? And you'll see it's asking and saying, hey, it appears this app wants to read, in this case, information about the users who are browsing the site. So I'll say yes, please do go out and trust it. And where that information is coming from is if I drill into the application manifest and take a look at what it's set up like inside of Visual Studio, you'll notice that I've already pre-configured the SharePoint app to say I'm going to be wanting to eventually read some information out of the user profile of the user in SharePoint. And I would also like to be able to write information back to the tenant that's running inside of SharePoint. And I actually make use of both of these permissions, and I'll show you where these permissions get exercised in a little bit. But okay, great. So we've done a bunch of work, we've hooked up things. Let's go ahead and refresh my home page. Let's go to my Documents library, right-click on my lighthouse picture, pop up the menu, and sure enough, there it is, my custom menu option that said, let's go buy some cake. And so when I click it, okay, it doesn't do a whole heck of a lot, but it pings me over to the site running in Azure Websites. And then similarly, if we take a look at the other integration points I chose, I go to the toolbar, and sure enough, there it is on the ribbon bar, the Celebrate text, that icon. Remember what I said earlier? It's coming from my website. I can guarantee you nowhere in SharePoint is there an icon that's as beautiful of a cake as that is. And then let's take a look at the last integration point that we had enabled. So I'm on the home page of my demo tenancy here. Let's flip the page into edit mode and say I would like to insert an app part. You see here on the left-hand side of the screen, right, my Fourth Coffee app part now shows up. So say, yep, I would like to add that to the page. And so we'll go ahead and let SharePoint chug away through on that for a little bit. So you can see it showing up. I will say, yep, please commit those changes to the layout of my page. And now every time I come to the home page of my site, using the same pixel layout as all of the other tiles here, I've got a representation of my site running over in Azure Websites, and I can click the link, and it navigates me out to it. So pretty straightforward stuff, and like I said, pretty cool that I can take something completely disconnected and unrelated to SharePoint and actually start tying it in and making it show up in the context of the UI. But having it gone through those three items, the thing that immediately comes to mind is it's a little bit of a pain that I have to keep on hitting the back button in order to get back to my site. So what I'm going to do is add a little bit more code into my site running up on Azure Websites. So the first thing I'm going to do is once again leverage that fact that I can reach back into SharePoint and get stuff out of it. So in this case, would have added in this line of code right here is once again I'm taking advantage of that host URL, and this time around I'm reaching back into SharePoint and saying, hey, get me a library of interesting JavaScript controls that I would like to use in the context of my site here. And the reason why I'm doing that is I want to have what will look roughly like the SharePoint, the toolbar that you sort of see across the very, very top of the page, and I would like to also display that inside of my site. So this is the specific reference to the SharePoint, quote-unquote JavaScript control. That's going to give me a sort of consistent look and feel for a navigation bar. It will give me a convenient link that will let me click on it and jump right back into SharePoint. And then I've also set up some of the other links or some of the other icons that are inside of this menu bar so that I can click further on into my site. Now in my case, since all of the changes I just made are only to the web app, I will only republish the web app. So we'll go ahead, republish the changes back up into Azure. Again, give WebDeploy a few seconds there to chug through and detect the changes. Go ahead and run the site. Of course, every time I update the DLLs, it's got to bounce the app domain, which is why there's a little bit of a pause. Okay. So, great. The site's there, but I'm not seeing my menu bar. Well, the reason why is I need to actually be clicking through to the site starting out in SharePoint. So here I am in SharePoint. Please bring me over to my bakery site. And you can see right up there on the top, it went ahead and popped in sort of consistent look and feel toolbar coming from SharePoint. I've got some of the icons where I can click other menu selections and go deeper into my site. And finally, I can just very quickly say, great, I would like to go back to my SharePoint site. So I no longer have to worry about going forward, backwards. I can just happily and seamlessly move from my SharePoint site into my site running over in Azure, and then happily hop right back again. So nice, clean, consistent navigation flow for my customers. All right, so the last thing I want to do to sort of tweak up this bakery site is actually have it read and write some information with SharePoint. So far we've just been doing sort of things that tell SharePoint, hey, the site's here, hey, let me get to it, but I'm not really, for my website, reaching into SharePoint and doing anything. So, since this is, of course, a miniature bakery site, I will go out and change it so that I can go ahead and place an order and have some of my information show up inside of SharePoint. So the first thing I'm going to do is drop in some code that the developers gave me. It's just sort of boilerplate code. I'm not going to walk through it in detail, but the long and the short of it is it's a helper dictionary for storing the OAuth access token information for each authenticated user that's coming to my site. So each time a different user comes in, I'm going ahead and sticking some of that token information into a little dictionary I have running inside of my website. Now, the reason why I'm doing that is that ultimately, for me as a developer, to be able to call from a website back into SharePoint, I need to be able to authenticate to it. Right? It's one thing to go out and just sort of click links and move back and forth. It's a completely different thing, however, to actually reach into SharePoint and say, give me some data. So with that OAuth token that I'm storing for each incoming user, I use that to construct a SharePoint client context. And as the name implies, right, like if you've worked with Entity Framework or OData, things like that, you have context, query context, things like that. So I'm basically using the OAuth information for the logged in user in SharePoint to build up a client context, and then I can go ahead and tell that context what kind of read or write operations I would like to perform on behalf of that user back in SharePoint. And what I'm doing here is I'm saying, hey, on behalf of this user, I actually want to go back into SharePoint, and I would like to get information about that user. So right here, I'm exercising that permission that I specified and showed you a few minutes ago that says, please grant my app the right to read information from the user profile. And then all I do with it is after the query completes, I say, great, I'd like to get the user's email address. And in my case, you'll see it in a minute or so, I actually use that to pre-populate an order form and pre-populate the email address where I'm going to send a notification off to. So that's reading some information. The second thing I'm going to do is after I've processed the order on my miniature site, I'm going to go out and write some information back to what's called the social feed for the current user in SharePoint. So what I'm going to do is, again, using a helper I have for manipulating the RSS feed back in SharePoint, I'm going to call back into SharePoint, and I'm basically going to say, hey, you ordered this product, and I'm going to give you a nice link to the pictures and some text, et cetera, et cetera. But it's just a simple example of my site running over in Azure, reaching into SharePoint and saying, hey, here's some data I need you to go store on behalf of this user. So we'll go out, save those changes. Again, the only thing I've changed is my site running in Azure. So I will just republish it. So once again, give it a little bit of time to first chug through and publish it up to Azure, and then recycle the site and bring it back up. And then once we know that the site's up and running, I'll flip back over to SharePoint, because once again, I want to start out as an authenticated user in SharePoint. We will navigate into my bakery app. And great, let's go get something tart, like a lemon tart. So the first thing that you'll notice, right, I just pre-populated the email address text box here. So that was the first part of the handshake. My site did an auth authenticated call back into SharePoint, said for the person who's currently clicking around on my site, get me the email address out of their user profile. So, great, we're going to go out and have some lemon tarts on the front lawn, because that's a great place to have them. And when I hit this checkbox right here, that's the code I have in my app that says, please go out and write some information back to my social feed in SharePoint, letting everyone who's following me know that I just went ahead and ordered some items. So let's go back into my SharePoint site and go over to my social feed. So pull up the About Me page. And sure enough, there's me, Mr. Koala, who just got some lemon tarts that are going to be delivered on the front lawn. So literally in real time, we just went from the site running in Azure, posted it into SharePoint, and the information shows up. So okay, that was in a nutshell what I wanted to walk through with you in the code of just showing, like I said, a piece of code that has nothing to do with SharePoint. In the last 25 minutes, we just made it do a lot more with SharePoint. And that, in essence, is sort of that's the thrust of a lot of the effort that the folks in SharePoint have invested into opening up SharePoint Online and making their APIs available for all kinds of developers to call into and make use of. The other thing, hopefully, takeaway that you got from the first half of the talk is that just onboarding to Azure websites, very simple. All you need is a live ID. I'll grant you, we will ask you for a credit card, but we won't actually charge you. And then you can go off to the races. We let you create upwards of 10 free websites in each geographical location around the world. So as developers, you can actually do a heck of a lot with playing around with our service. And then again, if you like it, you just flip up to one of those 4 pay modes, and from there you can scale up to paid, shared, or reserved instances. And then as we just saw with the app, basically I'm just scratching the surface of what's there, but I think for a lot of developers, and especially also a lot of third parties and ISVs, since at this point you no longer need to run your custom code inside of SharePoint or inside of the SharePoint sandbox, the sky's pretty much the limit in terms of all kinds of crazy things that you can come up with, develop, and actually project it and present it inside of the SharePoint site for your customers. So okay, that's the talk. Thank you everyone for attending. We do have a couple of minutes here, and I don't think that anyone's actually coming in for a little while, so if folks have questions, either feel free to step up to the mic, or again, I'll be here for a few minutes. Feel free to come up and talk to me. Thank you.